Morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or even good evening, depending where you are. One of the big advantages of doing an online course is that it doesn't really matter where you are or when you do it. So wherever you are and whatever time of day it is for you, welcome. Welcome to the Cambridge Online CLIL course. We've 4 short modules for you, designed both for teachers familiar with CLIL and those completely new to it. Hopefully you'll find it very practical and be able to go into your next CLIL sessions feeling more confident and with some practical activities ready to use. As a practicing teacher myself, I know that theory is great, but we also want something practical to do on Monday morning. So my name's Jane Delaney, and I'm a primary and secondary school teacher, as well as a teacher trainer. I've been teaching CLIL classes for the last 20 years. I teach in primary and secondary, and I mainly teach science, art, and geography. So my children range from 14 to 18 years of age. So as you can imagine, it's quite a range of things that I do every day. As you can also imagine, it's an awful lot of fun, but also a lot of hard work. CLIL can seem like very hard work at the beginning. Stick with it because it's very, very worthwhile. And like I said, our focus will be mainly on the practical. I'm going to share my screen with you now and turn off my camera because I'd really like you to engage with the content. Okay, let's go. So the course is made up of 4 modules. In module 1, we'll look at some theory and think about how to make things easier for our students and ourselves before we start teaching. We'll look at some visible thinking routines and also activating prior knowledge, 2 really useful techniques to help us get started. Hopefully this will form a sound basis for your first or next steps in CLIL. In module 2, we'll look at content and language, and after looking at some theory, provide you with some practical ideas to use in the classroom straight away. Excuse me. In module 2, we will look at reading and listening skills, especially at exploring authentic texts. There are many authentic materials out there on the internet, in books, in newspapers, in magazines, but it can seem a real challenge to use them in the lesson. Hopefully, we'll look at some ways to make it easier for students and also the teacher. If it's difficult for the teacher, it's going to be difficult for the students. So we have to make sure we can all manage it. In module 4, we'll look at assessment, the issues that arise from CLIL, and also some techniques for assessment that you may find helpful. So today, background to CLIL, visible thinking routines, and also activating prior knowledge. So what is CLIL? For those of you who aren't familiar with the concept, CLIL is Content Learning Integrated Language. In CLIL, we use the foreign language to learn content as well as communicate. So the subject matter, or content as we call it, determines the language that our students need to learn. So we use a foreign language to teach a core school subject, something that's common on all curriculums. For example, art, natural science, geography, history, even maths. In CLIL, all or most of the content is delivered in English. The teacher may be the school English teacher or a specialist subject teacher. Every context is different. It really depends on where you work and also what the makeup of your staff room is like. So basically, in CLIL, we use a foreign language to learn content as well as language, as well as communication. Teaching theory and MBE, mind-brain education, shows us that when a teacher reads aloud from the whiteboard, the students are much less engaged with the material and their level of cognitive working is much lower. For this reason, throughout this series of presentations, I'm going to try and limit the amount of reading aloud from the whiteboard that I do. So I'd like you to take a few moments, look at the whiteboard or my screen, read silently and think about what the potential answers are here. I'll give you a moment. Okay, let's go. Oops. CLIL is an approach in which a foreign language is used as the medium for teaching. A content subject such as science, history, or art. The target language and the subject content have a joint role in the learning. Joint role is quite interesting because some of you might be teaching both. You might be the English language teacher and the CLIL teacher, or you might just be the CLIL teacher, or you might just be the English language teacher. As I mentioned before, every context is different and every context is respectable. These are all just slightly different approaches to teaching CLIL. Learners in CLIL programs are from the primary, secondary, and also adult sectors of education, which is quite interesting. In the UK, there are several further education colleges which are teaching vocational lessons or vocational subjects in a foreign language, which is quite interesting. Let's move on. What CLIL subjects do you teach? What levels? As I mentioned before, school subjects such as art and natural science are very common, especially at lower levels in primary schools, as they tend to be very, very visual subjects. Subjects such as citizenship and history can have a lot of very dense texts, which can make it more difficult for very young children to comprehend meaning. So we tend to avoid those at very low levels. At low levels, everything's very visual. So the meaning can be got across by a picture or by a model or by a short video. Anything that's visible or tangible to the student makes it easier. At very low levels, we tend to avoid dense texts. In Module 3, we'll be looking at dealing with texts and skills work in CLIL, but for the moment, we don't do that. Here we have a very brief timeline with some information about the history of CLIL. Here the evolution starts in 2002, but really CLIL has been around since the early 1990s. Please take a moment and read. Okay, there are very many different models of CLIL. Some educators talk about hard or soft CLIL, strong or weak CLIL, different types of methodology. We tend to speak less about CLIL methodology these days and talk more about an approach, because CLIL isn't something that's finite, as we've learned. For example, hard, strong CLIL is one in which there is absolutely no connection with the child's native language. There's no use of translation, and the content tends to be very, very strictly delivered, as if it were to children who were native speakers. Soft or weak CLIL is an approach which allows for translation from the students' native languages, which is becoming more and more popular. It's less strict in terms of accuracy. Hard CLIL tends to be very rigid in its approach and also its demands on the students. With hard CLIL, only English can be spoken in the classroom, which can be very limiting. However, research into translanguaging means that it's now more acceptable for the teacher to use more than one language in a classroom lesson. Depending on your school context, however, your school might not support that. Your school might support one teacher, one language, which again is very respectable. However, other schools allow translanguaging to take place. Translanguaging, where the students are allowed to use their native language in the classroom, is supposed to mimic the way that young bilingual children use their linguistic resources to make sense of and interact with the world around them. However, rather than speak in such rigid terms these days, we now tend to define CLIL as an approach towards integrating content and language, a way of thinking and making our students think in a different way. So you might wonder, why CLIL? There are many advantages of the CLIL approach, and I'll show you some now. Please take a moment to read my screen. There are many advantages to teaching CLIL or the CLIL approach, far too many to list here. What's really important, however, and what you can see instantly from the diagram, is that the learners are at the centre of the lesson. The children or the teenagers or the young adults are at the centre of everything we do in CLIL. Rather than concentrating on what the teacher does or what the teacher delivers or what the teacher wants during the lesson, we focus on what the children can do. Our approach towards teaching changes and gives the students more opportunities to be involved, to be creative, to be active. So, what are the 4 C's of CLIL? Those of you who are new to CLIL might not know this. Those of you who are old hands, who are familiar, will already know. We have 4 C's. We have content, we have communication, we have cognition, and we have culture. We're going to talk more about content in Module 2, when the subject matter of the lesson actually is going to be discussed. This is what the topic is. What do we want the children to learn? What's our objective? Communication is something that runs through a thread throughout every CLIL lesson, something meaningful and hopefully something personal to the students. Depending on the content, communication might be a little bit complex. It may be difficult to make things meaningful or personal to the students if we're talking about some aspects of maths or some aspects of complicated science. Depending on the content, however, wherever we can, we try and make a personal connection to the topic for the students. Cognition is something we'll be talking about in this module, Module 1, learning and also thinking skills. Culture is also sometimes referred to as community. Again, this has a personal connection to the students. More about that later. I'm going to pause for a moment now and ask you to watch this short video in which the New York educationalist Jerome Bruner talks about teaching and learning. While you watch, I'd like you to think about the question you can see on the screen. How does teaching influence learning? If you can get a pen and paper to take notes, that would be fabulous. Okay, we have a question and I'd like you to watch the video. Let's go.
I'm Jerome Bruner, and this man has come to interview me about what the effects of teaching are, what can teaching do for a learner, and I'm about to tell him that the main thing about teaching is that it opens up a wider range of possibility of what's possible. You teach them about something in the past or the present, but you hope that your teaching will have the good effect of leading them into the world of possibility. That's where intelligence lies. And it's a risky kind of a business, because the fact of the matter is, when people tell you to ask you about teaching and you say it's about the future, they'll say, oh, but that's too speculative. But that's what teaching should be for, to get you speculating about possibility. We mostly, particularly in the Western world, we like people to stick to the factual, to what goes on now. And I say the main object of teaching and educating is get them to think and share their notions about where this leads, to go beyond the information given. As I think I once titled a book or something like that, yeah. So comes the question, are there rules of education? Yeah, there are pretty general rules of computation, but they should be related to some general domain of knowing, knowledge, and that kind of thing. It should not let you sit where you are. I keep using that expression, going beyond the information given. And that's what it's about. And eventually, we teach in a fashion that leads the person himself to learn how to converse with others, to share with others in a way that opens the world. It's an opening type of operation. And that's one of the reasons why, if it's only about the past, as some rather old-fashioned historians used to think, it gets you nowhere. Back to the past. And the way our schools developed in the old-fashioned way was to think that they were the repository of stored knowledge to pass on to new pupils. You can get that better out of a book in some respects, but it's the business of going beyond, thing like that. So I ask you, why are you doing this? What do you hope it will lead people who listen to get out of it? And I won't press you for an answer because you're supposed to be interviewing me, not me interviewing you. But on the other hand, it's also impossible for somebody to interview somebody else without their interviewing them back. It's opening, possibility. I keep coming back to that word, possibility, and with good reason. What is culture? Culture is a way of knowing, basically. It's a way of knowing that relates to the constraints imposed by a certain way of life. That is to say, we are both individuals and we live in a culture. And we somehow maintain our individuality and at the same time become New Yorkers or Americans or Russians and live that way. So it's a back and forth between the possible and the actual, and learning how to make that leap. Not only learning how, but learning that it's necessary to do it, to use your being to its fullest extent.
Well, I don't know really what to say after watching that video. I don't know about you, but I find it incredibly inspirational. I love the concept of opening, of possibility, of culture as a way of knowing things. Jerome Bruner talks about making that leap between the possible and the actual. To me, that's what CLIL's all about, opening up minds and helping our students to jump into a whole new world of exciting possibilities and interesting things to do. Teaching is about the future, he says. It's about speculation. Teaching isn't factual. It's about going beyond the information we give students. I think that's really, really interesting. And I think a lot of it can be applied to CLIL. I also like the idea of communication. He's being interviewed in this video and he says it's impossible to be interviewed without interviewing somebody back. And to me, that sums up CLIL, that sums up the communication aspect. The students aren't just communicating with the teacher in CLIL lessons, they're actually communicating with each other. And the element of peer collaboration can be really, really strong. Anyway, that's enough about me and Jerome Bruner. If you do have any thoughts on the video, please let us know in the forum. That would be very interesting. So, what are the conditions needed to learn our mother tongue? Because a lot of CLIL research is based on trying to recreate the same kind of conditions that a child learns its native language. So what are the conditions needed and how are they similar maybe to CLIL? So a very young child has a reason and a need to learn language. Children learn to speak because they have to communicate their needs, At first, they're related to food, drink, going to the bathroom, toys. Language is a survival strategy and linked entirely to the self. Well, we've just mentioned how important communication and speaking is in CLIL and how much the personal is important. And we'll see later in some of our activities how we do that. A child is the center of attention in the family. Well, depending on how many children are there and also the socioeconomic level of the family. But in general, young children are surrounded by adults and other people, and they are the center of attention. Again, this is a parallel with what we mentioned earlier. The learners are the center of all our objectives, of everything we do in the lesson. A child receives praise and encouragement from adults all the time. Usually caregivers say, well done, good boy, good girl, when children get things right. They also say good boy, good girl, well done, when children get things wrong or not quite right. And I think that's really, really important and something we always have to keep in mind. We mustn't be afraid of making mistakes, ourselves as teachers or the children. The classroom is a safe place to get things wrong and a safe place to not know things. When praise and encouragement is absent, when children don't receive it from adults, quite often they have behavioural problems and even maybe learning difficulties later on. The child interacts with many, many people. They're normally surrounded by people, so there's lots of opportunity to hear, see, and interact with their own language. Research shows that children who are isolated and who don't have that kind of interaction never learn their native language, or as we call it, L1, fluently. Children see exaggerated facial expressions and gestures all the time. Remember, when we look in a baby's face, our eyes and our mouth are enormous to them, and we can see this in children's drawings, how big those features are. This is something we do a lot in CLIL as well, exaggerated facial expressions, gestures to get our meaning across and also to engage our students. The child hears language repeated every single day, large quantities of language over a very long period. Clean your teeth, don't do that, eat your dinner, sit down, put your shoes on. And to a large extent, we do this a lot in the CLIL classroom as well. Repetition of basic instructions, repetition of target language, repetition of vocabulary. A child plays and experiments with language a lot. For example, a child might talk about getting off-dressed rather than undressed. They might add ed to all verbs to make the past simple. I goed, I seed, and so on. So there is a very playful and experimental stage. And this is where maybe a very rigid CLIL method was lacking. We didn't give the students a lot of opportunity to experiment, to make mistakes, to get things wrong, which is so important. A child is not constantly corrected or taught grammar explicitly. The way we speak to young children isn't how we'd speak to an adult. We use simple, short sentences and maybe simple vocabulary. We don't correct them explicitly. Children only want to communicate and get their method across. Teachers and parents don't attempt grammar lessons. We might reformulate language when a student gets things wrong. For example, the child that says, I go to the cinema, we might say, oh, you went to the cinema. Reformulation is very, very common in all infant and primary education, and especially in CLIL. Basically, one of the most central tenets is the child speaks when he or she is ready. It takes time. A child needs all of these conditions to learn how to speak. And it's part of our CLIL challenge to create those conditions in the classroom. CLIL takes time. And what we shouldn't do is punish ourselves as teachers because we think the children aren't learning fast enough. We've got to be very, very clear about what we want to achieve in our lessons and think of the strategies that can help our students.